I have just placed finishing touches on my most recent cemetery documentary, The History of the Submerged Cemetery at Mullins Cove. This is a real history lesson. We will learn about long family members who are buried here. We will discover the geology in the Mullins Cove area, and we will gain a better understanding of why this cemetery is still underwater. If you would like to learn even more about this cemetery, I have a longer video available on my website, thecemeterydetective.com. If you have a civic group who would like to hear this presentation live, please send me a message. Now, grab your Cemetery Explorer hat. I am thrilled to bring you the Submerged Cemetery at Mullins Cove. The year is 1807, and Henry Long has reached the headwaters of the Tennessee River after beginning his journey in Virginia. With over 200 river miles to travel, Henry faces turbulent rapids as his crude raft follows the river's flow. Interestingly, the same river that is about to give Henry the adventure of a lifetime will continue as part of his story more than 140 years after his death. But this river hides several mysteries. Why is this cemetery underwater? Who is buried next to Henry Long? What is Henry's relationship to Moses? And where are Moses' parents buried? My name is Keith, and on this episode of The Cemetery Detective, I will research the Submerged Cemetery at Mullins Cove. By 1807, Henry Long was growing weary of living in Jonesboro, Tennessee. His sights were set deeper into this newly formed state. Tennessee was only 11 years old at the time, and there were plenty of opportunities deeper in the state. Along with two companions, Henry boarded a crudely designed raft and began floating down the confluence of the French Broad and the Holston rivers. In an effort to better understand the life of Henry Long, I am paddling the confluence of the Holston and the French Broad rivers. These two rivers joined together to form the headwaters of the Tennessee River. Of course, it wasn't called the Tennessee River back in 1807 when Henry Long first floated his raft on these waters. Back then, it was known by such names as the Hogohigi or the Great River of the Cherokees. This area was still largely influenced by the Cherokee Nation, but Euro-Americans were streaming into the newly formed state of Tennessee. As the political landscape of this area was much different in those days, so too was the economic and environmental landscapes. For example, this railroad bridge over my right shoulder is known as the Three Rivers Trestle. It's a short-line bridge that was not built until 1913. More than 100 years after Henry Long navigated these waters. Back in those days, this was largely an undammed river. These waters flowed freely through Knoxville, Lenoir City, Chattanooga, and southward to Mullins Cove, which is more than 200 river miles from this confluence. Can you imagine paddling a crude raft down these waters without modern conveniences and electronics and without even proper maps? This was an unmanaged river. There were no dams back in those days, and the river flooded with the spring rain and dried up with the summer drought. Henry navigated his way downstream past Knoxville and past Chattanooga, which was a simple Cherokee outpost at the time. But Henry wasn't ready for Mullins Cove, at least not yet. It's here in the Sequatchie Valley that he first settled down, and he began a business as a livestock trader. Along with his new bride, Zilpha, they began to grow a successful business as well as an ever-growing family. But Henry and Zilpha weren't satisfied with the confines of the Sequatchie Valley. They wanted land, and lots of land. And with the same eagerness and tenacity that Henry floated down the Tennessee River, he and his family began cutting away the underbrush of their newly acquired 2,000-acre farm in Marion County, Tennessee. From the mountaintops all the way down through the fertile bottomland, Henry and Zilpha hacked their way through the thick canebrake that inundated the land. But they cleared the land and operated a successful business here for many years. In 1860, Zilpha passed away, and she was buried in a small cemetery about a quarter mile from the river on their land. Henry passed away in 1875, and he was buried alongside his wife. Generations came and generations went, and some of Henry and Zilpha's descendants were buried in this cemetery also. For instance, there was Moses Merritt Long, who was born in 1880 and died at 3 months of age in 1881. When I began studying the cemetery, I found news articles claiming that Henry, Sarah, and their child Moses are buried in this cemetery. However, I have studied these gravestones over and over again, and Zilpha, not Sarah, is buried in this cemetery. I can find no evidence that Sarah is buried here, although there is a Sarah on the family tree. Now, there's a curious thing about Zilpha's gravestone. Zilpha spelled her name Zilpha, but on the gravestone, the last 2 letters of her first name are transposed. The gravestone carver misspelled her name Zilpah. These gravestones are difficult to read. Someone taking a cursory glance might see the last 2 letters spelled AH and mistakenly believe that this is Sarah's gravestone. However, it is definitively Zilpha's gravestone. Her date of birth and date of death correlate to her life, and also on the gravestone it says, wife of Henry Long. This land stayed in the family, but big changes were coming to this area. There was a need for easier river navigation, and there was also a need for electric power. By 1905, plans were underway for the first hydroelectric multi-purpose dam across a navigable waterway built by private industry. That dam was built 5 miles downstream of the cemetery across a section of the Tennessee River known as Hales Bar. When Hales Bar Dam was completed in 1913, the lake levels rose to 626.2 feet above mean sea level. The waters would have been closing in on this cemetery. However, in the 1920s, flashboards were placed across the spillway, raising lake levels an additional 3 feet to 629 feet above mean sea level. TVA came into existence in 1933, and by 1939 they had purchased Hales Bar Dam. Then, in 1949, TVA sought to raise lake levels, and so they increased the dam's capacity and raised lake levels an additional 5 3/4 feet to approximately 634 feet above mean sea level. According to my GPS, and using some crude surveying techniques, ground level of the cemetery appears to be approximately 631 feet above mean sea level. Now, this indicates that the cemetery became flooded in 1949. However, it is possible that silting has occurred over the decades, raising ground levels. Also, in 1999, TVA righted the gravestones and built a wall of riprap around the perimeter of the cemetery. Either of these scenarios could mean that the elevation of the cemetery was lower in the 1920s, and therefore might have been flooded prior to TVA's involvement with the dam. Irrespective of all this, TVA does have a structured cemetery removal policy. TVA does have a structured cemetery removal policy. In fact, they have moved more than 550 cemeteries within their system. But according to TVA officials, this cemetery was underwater long before they came on the scene. Additionally, there's evidence that a 1944 agreement with family members of those buried in the cemetery asked that their bodies and the grave sites remain in place. Hales Bar Dam had severe foundational issues which threatened its longevity. Hales Bar is of geological interest. The dam was built on a bedrock of limestone. This is Mississippian-age Bangor limestone, and it has a tendency to form a fractured kind of system. It's called a karst formation, and this karst formation is very porous to water, and engineers worked for 20 years to try to fix this underlying problem of the dam. At one point, water was flooding underneath the dam at a rate of 2,000 cubic feet per second. That was so much water that TVA had a problem generating electricity from the dam's intended purpose. By the 1950s and the 1960s, TVA realized that this dam was economically unviable, and they decided that the only thing to do was to build another dam, a replacement dam, 6 miles downstream, and then destroy Hales Bar Dam. Nickajack Dam was completed in 1967, and Hales Bar Dam was completely deconstructed by September of 1968. I've kayaked this entire section of river all the way up to the cemetery and back, and this part of the river is so turbulent. It's kind of almost frightening, but I can feel the rapids just pulling me through. And I can only imagine underneath the surface of the water, probably 30, 40 feet down, there must be a tremendous system of limestone, fragmented rock. It's just a really fantastic geological wonder what lies beneath me right now. Nickajack Dam, 11 miles downstream, maintains lake levels at approximately 633 feet above mean sea level, give or take a foot or two every day. That means that this cemetery is almost always either at lake level or slightly above or slightly below lake level. And what that means is that the gravestones are almost always visible. There is one other gravestone readily visible in this cemetery, Moses Merritt Long, Henry and Zilpha's great-grandson. But if Moses is buried here, it really makes me wonder where his parents are buried. So I've used an aerial photography platform to scan this entire area looking for potentially submerged grave sites outside of this cemetery. I haven't been able to find any other grave sites, but I was able to find another cemetery a few hundred yards from here up in a wooded section on dry land. So I paddled over to explore that cemetery, and I was able to find several of Henry and Zilpha's descendants. I was even able to find James Long, Moses' father, but Moses' mother, Rhoda Emma Greer Long, was nowhere to be found. But I did find her with research. After Rhoda's husband, James, passed away, Rhoda moved closer to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and she was buried there in 1936. Think about what was happening in 1936. The waters had already risen and were lapping at the perimeter of this cemetery, making it difficult, if not impossible, for Rhoda to visit her son, who died at 3 months of age. When I thought about that, it made me sad. And so I visited Rhoda's gravesite, and I took her flowers in memory of her son, who died in 1881 by the name of Moses Merritt Long. Now, I hope this doesn't sound too weird, but when I placed the flowers on Rhoda's gravesite, I felt something, as if Rhoda and Moses somehow appreciated the reconnection.